Welcome to the Palm Court Podcast. Mike Palmer here. We're back. It's 2025. We made it. I'm joined, as always, by Megan Citron and Grant Balfour. Megan, coming out of the hills of Madrid. Megan, welcome back to the
Hi,
podcast.
happy New Year to
Hap-
everyone.
Happy New Year. Great to have you. And our resident Florida man, Grant Balfour, is back. Grant, welcome back to the podcast.
Happy Three Kings Day.
Yeah,
Yes.
the day after.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
they came.
Yeah.
They came and they went.
Close enough. Interestingly, I think for all of us, January 6th, the Feast of the Epiphany, Three Kings Day, the anniversary of the congressional riots.
Insurrection,
Correct.
hostile takeover.
And then the hostile takeover. So let's bring it back home to our alma mater, New College, where a little over 2 years ago, the installation of new members of the Board of Trustees happened by the DeSantis administration, which kind of got the ball rolling on everything we've been documenting here on this podcast. And we've been relying heavily on good reporting, great journalism. And we're very fortunate today to be joined by journalist Kathryn Joyce, who's been reporting on this story. She has a really fantastic article in These Times. Kathryn is investigative editor at In These Times and the author of The Child Catchers, Rescue, Trafficking, and the New Gospel of Adoption, and Quiverful Inside the Christian Patriarchy Movement. Kathryn, welcome to the Palm Court Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. And we always like to start before we get into your article, which we'll share, and it is recommended reading for everyone who's listening. Feel free to read along as we go. But before we do that, we always like to get to know our guests on a human level first. So can you catch us up on who you are and, how you got to this point in your life?
Yeah, sure. I'm a journalist based in New York State, and I have been writing about the right wing primarily for about 20 years. So that's kind of the long backstory of how I found my way to this story. I have written a lot about the Christian right, as you can kind of tell by the titles of the two books that you read that are now a little bit on the older side, as am I. From to kind of writing about other facets of the right, kind of different right-wing political movements, like post-liberalism or national conservatism. I've written a fair amount about the Catholic right recently, but writing about the right wing has also meant, in the last 7-8 years in particular, writing about education. So I started writing about education and the right, not exactly knowing that I was doing so, but when I covered not the terrible tragedy of the Parkland shooting back in 2018, but some of the aftermath that took place in Broward County when that tragedy got turned into a vehicle to go after various progressive education policies, in particular efforts to reform school discipline. So I spent 3/4 of a year just reporting out what the Obama administration had tried to do in terms of addressing the so-called school to prison pipeline. Why were schools turning into this pathway for so many students, particularly students of color, to kind of have their lives completely derailed? And then how, incidentally, it was a right-wing activist at the Manhattan Institute, where Chris Rufo is from, but not Chris Rufo, this guy, Max Eden, who really kind of leapt on the moment of this tragedy to push what was his, sort of keystone issue, which was the idea that school discipline reform was bad, that it was turning schools into dangerous places, and kind of forced the tragedy into this narrative that it had something to do with that. It didn't, but it worked really well. It eventually led to the ouster of the superintendent, a number of board members, lots of repercussions for the program that was in place in Broward and around the country. So that was kind of my introduction, and it was in Florida. A couple of years later, when I was still talking to some of the sources in Broward County School District about what was going on there, they started talking about, this thing is happening and it's part of the war on public education, which I'm ashamed to say that at the time I was like, what do you mean, what war on public education?
Right.
And started learning an awful lot from there. And then I think, all of us did as a country, anybody who's paying attention to it, started seeing how, particularly, in 2020, in the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter protests and in the midst of the pandemic, culture war issues became the guiding issue on the right, and also we're carrying along with them, this deeper, kind of longer standing right wing effort just to defund public education, to, shift as many students as possible out of it. So
Mhm.
I've spent a fair amount of time focused on that, reporting on like how specifically that was playing out in Sarasota County for the Hechinger report,
Right.
which I had started, 2 years and a month ago. And then, a month into that reporting project, I had to call my editor and be like, something really crazy has just happened, not, in the K-12 schools, but in a college that's also right there. So yeah, that was my introduction. I wrote a little bit about New College at the time for Vanity Fair. And then a year later, I met Juliana Pare. I met her at a conference down in Flagler College
Oh, yeah,
on
right.
the other side of the state that was dedicated to looking at attacks on education, particularly at the college level.
In terms of your educational background, we had Libby Harity on the show a little while back, and she was talking about how many of the new college diaspora have landed at your alma mater, Hampshire College. Can you catch folks up a little bit on that?
I went to Hampshire College. At Hampshire, we say our class year by when we entered because people take various times to complete. I think that's also a new college thing.
Yes.
Yep.
From F97. Yeah, it was a really good place for me to be. I think one of the things that has really made the new college story resonate for me is I went to Hampshire as a Pell Grant student and, was in a pretty significant minority. There was a lot of rich kids at Hampshire. Hampshire is a pretty expensive school. And the idea that there was an option to get a similar education, but at an affordable price, I think is an amazing thing. And to me, that makes it so much more profound
Hmm.
what's been lost with this takeover.
Well, that's something that's certainly come up frequently is that many of us wound up in new college, not just because of its academic philosophy, but also because of its affordability.
Yeah.
I think that's easy to forget. The new ideology is associated with the university as almost a litmus test where, suddenly access to that affordability is tied with other challenges. The name of the article is The New College Gambit, the right wing takeover of Florida's public honors college blurs the line between tragedy and farce, but attacks on universities are about to get worse. It was published December 9th, 2024. We wanted to get you while it was still hot off the presses or at least warm. And, we're sort of in an interim right now where the new administration, the Trump administration, is coming online in a couple of weeks. And we are kind of looking ahead to 2025. There's some of that, I think, in the article. But what I was really most impressed with, and I think we all were, was just the comprehensiveness where the reporting really does an outstanding job of capturing the complexity and the depth of what has happened in what's surprising to me that it was just 2 years now, because it does feel like so much has transpired. I think folks now are aware of how this maybe bubbled onto your radar, but then can you maybe go a level deeper into how the story began to unfold and how you tried to lay it out for people in the article?
If you're asking kind of about process, one of the kind of most time consuming things that I end up doing, maybe it's also a bit of a writing procrastination, is I do try to read as much as possible. So I ended up reading a huge amount of prior reporting that has been done on it, of which there's been some incredible prior reporting that I relied on so much. The local paper, the Sarasota Herald Tribune.
Stephen Walker was a guest on the show.
I think also Zach Anderson.
Zach
Both of
Anderson,
them,
yeah. They both
Um,
have gone
yeah,
on, but yeah.
yeah, hugely relied on their reporting as well as, some of the other localish papers, Tampa Bay Times,
Mm.
Yeah.
others. But also, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of work that was put out by people within the community that was hugely helpful, both excellent written work on its own, but also just kind of research that people were gathering together that was kind of invaluable. And also, was so much more. I mean, Thank you. That's really nice to hear that it came across as comprehensive. And I'm also thinking of like the 5,000 words that got cut for
Yeah.
was already probably a TLDR.
Have you thought about turning it into a book?
I think that there is a lot to write about what has been happening to higher ed.
There's also the context of the charter
Yeah.
schools and the connection between Corcoran and what happened with the charter schools in Jefferson County. I mean, there's anywhere where you pull, there's more stuff.
There is so much. I was just reading some stuff about the incoming administration and some of the people that Trump is hoping to install. The fandom for so-called classical education is shot through in all these places. There's Pete Hegseth, talking about how perhaps this could be installed through the education curriculum that is controlled by the DoD, that, for military families, there is something there that could then be used as a model for other red states. A couple of years ago when I was a reporter at Salon, I wrote one of the first big stories on Hillsdale College. So that was another thing that when everything happened at New College, it's Hillsdale all over again. No, I
Hillsdale
think
with
that
public
that's-
money.
I think it's a really important topic.
What I liked was that there was a well-researched way for me to wrap my head around what's going on, where the playbook, which conservatives were hoping to establish at New College,
Yeah.
what is that and how successful have they been? One of the themes that we've been talking about since this show started is that we may be looking for almost a Pyrrhic defeat here, where if we can cause enough casualties, if we can make it painful enough, slow enough, and with enough negative press, frankly, that perhaps this playbook will not be as appealing to be run elsewhere. But can you lay out what's happening and then maybe we can start to assess where we are today and what it means?
Yeah, I come at this from the left. I think public education, including public higher education, is a good, and I think dismantling it is a bad. But yeah, that was one of the most interesting things to me. And I did the kind of annoying reporter thing where I asked everybody I spoke to the same question and probably asked it more than once. But, like, is this playbook working? Chris Rufo said straight out, if we can take this gambit and if it's successful, we can replicate this in state after state. That's a paraphrase. And I think that was a big through line. Richard Corcoran recently released book, he talks all about how much he hopes New College would be a model. He talks about, his disappointment that he doesn't think that the model is being followed as closely or as quickly or as widely as he had hoped it would be. But yeah, I guess your question was, what is that model? I think it's the idea of a top-down takeover. This idea that institutions of higher ed have become ideologically captured, a phrase that they like to use a lot, by progressive ideology. They see it as being deeply embedded in so many different ways. They think kind of it's this deep rot, that it's spread by faculty, that, institutions of academic freedom, like tenure, are part of this kind of institutional rot. And so it needs to be addressed in this kind of like totalizing takeover way, that you can come into these, public universities, you can impose what one of the takeover trustees, Mark Bauerlein, has referred to as the trustee solution. So you can just, create this right-wing board that is then, going to be effectively acting as an extension of the governor administration that installed them. And that is something that we've started to see in a number of states that people on the right are arguing for explicitly. You're seeing that in states like Indiana, in Virginia, these kind of troubling arguments that boards of trustees of public universities are actually an extension of the state government and, whoever is in office in the governor's mansion at that time. And so the idea, I think, then is that you can have this board of trustees that starts enacting this right-wing agenda in different ways, by shutting down programs, obviously, that happen at New College, by closing kind of whole programs that might touch on many different programs, like DEI. That's obviously happening nationwide in so many different states now. One of the things, as I was reporting, the Chronicle of Higher Education has this tracker of anti-DEI initiatives or kind of decisions that are being made at the campus level. And so they just keeps ticking up. As I was reporting, just be like, no, we have to revise that number. Again, Chronicle has just added 5 more campuses in 3 more states. So I think like those things are happening at New College. There was also, you probably talked about this before, but there was also this idea of kind of subtraction by addition, this idea that if you just start adding people, faculty, visiting faculty, non-official faculty, and often hiring them through not regular means, that you can start to shift the composition of the faculty if you can kind of bypass normal faculty hiring procedures, which are also another bedrock principle of academic freedom, that the people with the expertise should be the people in charge of hiring the other people as to whether or not they also have the expertise to teach students, to design curriculum. So I think kind of doing all of these things at once, and I've said this before, and I've written this kind of before in writing about education, I also think that doing so many things at once is a huge part of the strategy. Like there
Yeah.
is just this intentional effort to overwhelm people.
Flood the zone.
You left out one of the weirdest things that they did, and I think the thing that none of us would have foreseen, which was to replace the entire student body as well with this sports program. And that seems like not as replicable because New College is kind of special in that it didn't even have real sports teams, real sports program, or even facilities. And then when they did that, they started to, drive away students, grow the student population, and then also create all of these construction projects that they could funnel money into.
I think that's huge. It's probably one of the most bizarre elements of it. And it also seems to be one of the things that, as I kept asking my annoying question of like, has this playbook worked? That a lot of the sharp people that I spoke to said, like, this is why this is not replicable, because this costs a lot of money. College is such a
Right.
small school.
So
And they're
expensive, those
so
scholarships.
much money to like draw these placement students
Mhm.
in and attract them, to athletic programs that don't exist, to inadequate numbers of safe and, clean housing spots.
Right.
All of this stuff. How are you going to do that at
It-
UBAC, for example?
It's insane. And then behind it is the ideological part, which is the remasculinization of higher education, which is the other part. How do we get rid of all these women and queer people? Well, we'll just make a third of the college a male baseball team. Where else are you going to be able to get away with that?
Yeah.
I think Mike and I figured out that it was almost a conference in and of itself. The New College baseball team is basically like almost a conference.
And you mentioned UF, which I think is another interesting element to the current state of play in higher ed in Florida, in that the Ben Sass story happened during this takeover, and the corruption and his inglorious exit in some ways perhaps woke up Tallahassee, or has at least changed the political climate in terms of tolerance for some of the activity. I'd love to hear a little more of your perspective on that. It did come up in the article.
Yeah. I mean, what I know about that is, probably what anybody who's paid attention to it knows, so much of which is thanks to the student journalism.
Yeah.
That
Go
was
Alligator.
Yeah. So
Garrett Shanley.
Yeah, much like at New College, a lot of really great student journalism also taking place that's holding folks to account. Yeah, it's pretty outrageous, reading what Ben Sass was able to pull off there, the amount of money that got spent hiring friends who weren't bothering to move to the state, who had, tallied up lots of expenses, flying back and forth, presumably not an economy. Some of the details of how it just wasn't there. Tens of thousands of dollars spent on a sushi bar for one
Mhm.
party. I mean, just the amazing waste that was going on there at the same time that there's all of these complaints about public tax dollars going to support so-called wokeness,
Mhm.
and things that, the public doesn't support. Surely the public does not support these things. As I was reporting, the Ben Sass example is, kind of remarkably obscene and probably the standout example. But some of the folks that I was talking to down in Florida, like Liv Coleman, who's a professor in Tampa, pointing out there have been so many different political appointees, or at least nominees, to Florida public universities and colleges that you almost can't believe it. And Ben Sass takes the cake, but the example of Randy Fine making such a stink because he was not hired to be the president of FAU, that he ended up, complaining so much that the search was suspended at FAU and the chair of that board resigned. I think that's just a remarkable statement about what a political spoil system university leadership is turning into in Florida. I'm sure there have always been lots of kind of influence peddling examples in all states, but that just seems, if you have an elected representative publicly saying of his own volition, not being caught in it, but like complaining publicly, like, it's really unfair. I did not agree to compete for this job.
I was promised this.
And then they started asking me what my qualifications were. That's an outrage. To me, that's pretty wild.
And then at the same time, the compensation for President Corcoran relative to what President Oker had. I mean, a lot of this stuff I think we're aware of, but like I said, the article does a really fantastic job of putting it all in one place. So folks should check that out. It's at In These Times. Kathryn, as we get closer to time here, we kind of wanted to understand, where are we now and what does this mean moving forward? This is 2 years in. There was some maybe ominous foreshadowing in the article as well, where as you were asking folks where they saw things headed in the next, say, 5 years, several folks were saying that perhaps they thought the college would not survive. So from your perspective, what were you hearing and what do you think might be on the horizon for New College?
I'll just refer mostly to what people told me because I think they're a much better place to have kind of that prediction than I am. But it was striking that almost to a person, everybody I spoke to about, what do you think is going to happen, said, we don't think New College is going to survive long term in any capacity as a Hillsdale clone or, as the institution that it used to be. The kind of most optimistic predictions that some people made were the idea that it might be absorbed into USF and kind of be something closer to what it used to be as kind of a standalone honors college. And a lot of people seem to think that that could be a really positive outcome if that did happen. But yeah, a lot of people seemed to think that, in terms of, we were just talking about the amount of money that was required to, as Megan said, to replace the student population and give this impression of thriving vitality, record student enrollment, new programs. But all of that has been costing a tremendous amount of money that, future iterations of the legislature are unlikely to be interested in supporting. That when DeSantis is gone, it's probably not that likely that the next governor will be interested in continuing this. I guess maybe the wild card there is the next
If it's
governor ends
Corcoran?
up being Richard Corcoran. Like, would he see this as part of his legacy? And thus, worth continuing to push for investment in. But yeah, there seemed to be a sense that, this was a political stunt that was tied to DeSantis running for president. With those sorts of things gone, the money that's keeping this alive will start to fade away and then be left with, the realities that many, underfunded institutions of higher education are faced with, which around the country, they're in pretty dire shape already. So I think that's grim, and I think that's really sad. Again, I mean, to me, the idea of an affordable Hampshire is an amazing kind of beautiful thing, and that seems to have been destroyed is a terrible thing. But I think one of the other common themes that came across with a lot of the people that I spoke to, Michael, this is what you were referring to with maybe the idea of a pure defeat, that preventing the playbook from being exported, from being replicated, is also a good goal, in lieu of maybe being able to actually save the college. A lot of faculty or former faculty that I spoke to expressed that, didn't make it into the piece just for space reasons, but former professor Aaron Hilgath said something to the effect of, what I care about now is what Texas Governor Greg Abbott sees when he looks at New College? Does he see what a failure this was? So in a state that otherwise has really been competing with Florida to crack down on education, is this going to be seen as actually a failed model that should not be replicated, and Texas maybe will do something else?
The stories from athletes that are coming out are also interesting. It's something worth continuing to track because it does sound like they were sold a bill of goods that wasn't really there when they got to New College. And then, NCAA athletics and the transfer portal is an entirely different conversation to get into, but you could imagine the churn on that side to be pretty significant. I did see something in your article that I thought was worth noting here from, I believe it was the keynote by M. Gesson on the alt graduation. 3 painful lessons new college students had been forced to learn. 1, that institutions are fragile. 2, that autocracies have a dumbing down effect. And 3, that they couldn't trust the state to defend their education. And you mentioned the word grim, and I actually think it's perhaps time to be grim and to still find resolve and find lessons and find meaning in this current landscape. That was one thing that I did find really throughout the reporting here, but that to me did seem like some meaningful takeaways perhaps from the last 2 years as we're, getting close to time here. Thoughts on that front, lessons learned, or things that we could take away from what's really transpired in Florida over the last 2 years?
I'll never disagree with the idea that it's time to be grim. A lot is grim. Maybe it's just that has been the subject matter that I've covered in one way or another for a couple decades now, has always been pretty grim. That is what kind of effective activism comes from, is understanding the scope of the problem. And it is a deep and complicated problem. There is the culture war angle that has been so profitable for the right. There is also kind of the deeper underlying, kind of and more systemic defunding that has been going on for decades that primed a lot of these schools to be targets. They are deep in systemic problems. They require systemic issues. We have to look at that pretty squarely if we're going to kind of undertake the long-term fight to try to turn some of this around.
Maybe on that front, PEN America is an organization that's cited as, a defender of academic freedom. We've had Jeremy Young and Sophia Brown on the show. Amy Reed is now working for PEN America. Are there places where folks are activated by this that you would recommend they look, or if they want to kind of channel some of their agitus, their aggression towards positive outlooks in these grim times? Any thoughts on that?
I think PEN America has been active. A number of professors that I spoke to from other colleges and universities as well talked about the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, which is not a union, but it's a professional organization for higher ed. And it has, in the last year, taken a really decidedly more activist stance. A lot of people have talked about the need for really active involvement of all kinds of different unions that touch workers in higher ed, from all different kind of categories of employment. That's going to be really important too. And that, one of the glimmers of hope is that, we are seeing more involvement from unions. We are seeing kind of more political resolve from groups like AAUP. It's notable because in the past, a lot of people have talked about this current moment as, a new McCarthyism, or even worse than McCarthyism. And, in the past, 60, 70 years ago, the AAUP actually kind of folded in the face of one of those earlier Red Scares, and that they're standing up now. A lot of people do see as, something hopeful. I think that those are good signs, people being, alert to kind of the depth of this threat, that, this is not just about beating up the gender studies department, that it goes a lot deeper than that this is not just Chris Rufo, being a jerk and misgendering people online in order to score points, that there actually is kind of a real deconstructive effort here to go after higher ed. And I think I mentioned Juliana Pare before, but I think, one of the things that she mentioned that I quoted briefly in the piece was, paying attention to what has happened in other countries where attacks on higher ed have gone this far. Look at Chile and what happened under the Pinochet dictatorship there. And, we don't have to be in a parallel situation to know that there really is a pretty equivalent threat happening.
And this is being exported from the United States to other countries too. Here in Europe, it's easy to see that this playbook is being pushed in other countries as well, especially diverting public funds into private hands and education.
In both directions too. I mean, it's coming from Hungary and then from the US back to Europe. So like it is something to continue to track. The other thing I think you mentioned really throughout, and hopefully folks are getting this too, is just the courage and the importance of independent journalists who are demonstrating the same fortitude that you did to put this together. And then the outlets that are continuing to publish these articles are the other place to kind of find hope and try to support those channels where they're out there. It's something we're going to try to continue to do here on this podcast. We're pretty much at time. Any final thoughts, Megan, Grant, before we wrap up here with Kathryn?
I just wanted to ask, it's sort of like a fluff question, but did you get to spend any time on campus? And if so, did you get to see how pretty it was, at least before parts of it were destroyed? Were there any favorite spots that you saw there?
Beautiful. I got to spend a fair amount of time on campus last spring. And then I got to spend a tiny bit of time on campus the spring before when I was working on that story about the Sarasota school board. I spoke with a now alum, then student, who was just kind of talking about the kind of connections between what was happening at New College and what was happening in the K-12 district. I'm talking to you from extremely cold, single-digit, snowy mountains right now, and being just at the bayfront there, it's incredible. It's stunning.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine a more idyllic place to spend time. And then talking with students and alumni about some of the physical changes, and faculty about some of the physical changes taking place on campus, about, the replacement, some kind of like organically created student hangout spots and replaced by these sort of like canned socializing locations that students weren't that into, the tearing up the grass. I just kept feeling like, oh, this is a beautiful thing that, is being torn apart here.
All on the estate of a circus magnates. The irony is it's kind of crazy.
Circuses were big in the 20s, so I will give the Ringlings a little bit of credit there. But Kathryn, thank you so much for joining us on today's show. A really wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. Please let us know what you want us to cover next. We'll include more information about Kathryn and her article in the show notes. This is the Palm Court Podcast. We'll be back again soon.